We just finished up the Fall 2024 Tinley Park NARBC, which means it is time for our annual State of the Ball Python Market video. 2024 has been a really interesting year coming off the 2023 post-COVID crash. But there has been a lot of, honestly, seismic activity occurring in the ball python world under the surface that we want to dive into, because not only does it explain the market in 2024, I think that it indicates a lot of stuff that is going to be coming in 2025 and maybe even 2026. So, my name's Steven with Leviathan, and let's get to it. Before we can dive into 2024, we have to talk a little bit about 2023, because 2023 was a difficult year for the ball python hobby. There was record high inflation for the years previous, and this created less buying power with the customer base within the reptile hobby. In addition, there was a reduction in demand because there wasn't as many newer breeders getting into the hobby, and those who were newer and who had gotten in during COVID didn't need to buy nearly as many animals as they had in the years previous. And then last is that there was an increase of supply because those COVID breeders were able to produce animals in earnest during 2023, and the larger, more established breeders had scaled up their operation and increased the animals they were producing during 2023. So all of these factors together created the situation of the post-COVID crash, where prices drastically fell during the year of 2023. So, 2024, did that trend continue? And I think that on an aggregate level, it didn't. I think that for the most part, the ball python and reptile hobby overall stabilized during 2024. Now, this doesn't mean that the prices went back up, but instead they held steady, they plateaued, and they stopped falling, which is a huge win for the ball python hobby. Now, there are a lot of different factors that go into this. One, I think that people pulled back on their pairings and they weren't making as many clutches as they had been in the past. Two, I think that shed testing has made it where people are able to be more selective with their breeding, and they didn't have to breed an entire clutch of pos hets in order to figure out which ones were het. Instead, they could test them and then know exactly which animals they wanted to breed, rather than breeding all of them. And then the last one, and I think is probably the most important factor and had the biggest impact on the hobby stabilizing, at least in prices, was Morph Market introduced auctions in January of 2024. There are a lot of different opinions on auctions and whether or not they are good or bad for the reptile hobby, but I think that it was auctions that really made it where people could move animals that were sitting for a long period of time, and because they were able to move so many animals, it allowed a lot of people to not be as worried and not keep cutting their prices so drastically in an effort to try to make the sale. Now, with the introduction of auctions, I think that this actually had a lot of different ripple effects that have drastically affected the ball python hobby or the ball python market during 2024. One is that I think that auctions were so successful at moving animals that a lot of buyers stopped really looking at the animals that were posted as normal listings on Morph Market and instead just watched the auctions if they wanted to buy something. What this ended up doing is it meant that the regular part of Morph Market, the kind of bedrock, the backbone of Morph Market, wasn't nearly as effective in 2024 as it had been in 2023, 2022, and especially in 2021. But there was a new addition to Morph Market, which was the auctions, that wildly excelled, and it was able to help everybody from the biggest breeders to the smallest breeders move animals in fast ways. Now, there is the reality that animals sold on auctions weren't going for their full retail value. I think that, in my opinion, that they generally went for anywhere between 50 to 80% of the retail value if it's sold on an auction. So this might seem like a bad thing, but let's say that you have an animal that is normally worth $1,000, but it might take you months in order to find the right buyer in order to spend $1,000 in order to buy that animal. So instead of having to care for that animal for months and months and months and hope that you can find the right buyer while the entire market is moving at the same point in time, so its value is actually going down and down and down, you could post that animal to an auction and maybe you only get $500 for it, but now you no longer have to care for that animal and you are able to get money in your pocket right away. So I think that a lot of people in the reptile hobby, especially when they had animals that were just sitting there and essentially costing them funds in order to care for it, really appreciated the auctions because it allowed them to move these kind of animals that just sat and didn't really have much of a demand previously. Going a little bit further, if you are a small breeder and you are going to list 2, 3, maybe 4 animals a month on the auctions, it didn't really impact your overall business very much because you just didn't have the volume in order to make auctions the driving force in whether or not your reptile breeding business was successful. But there are rather large breeders that once the auctions came out and it was shown how effective they were at moving animals, seemed to shift the majority of their business model towards using auctions. And what they would do is they would get their normally allocated amount of auctions based off of their Morph Market membership, and then they would pay $25 to get additional auctions every single month in order to move a lot of their animals. And again, you might think that that's going to add up really quick and maybe it's not worth it, but if we are going back to the idea that you have a $1,000 animal and you would be happy to get $500 for it just so you can move it on, even if you had to pay an additional $25, you are still making a profit and it was still really good for your business, especially if you have thousands of animals that you have to care for and your feeding bills alone are $5, $10, maybe even $15,000 a month. In these circumstances, it is imperative that you are able to move the hatchling animals that you produced really quickly. With all this said, the number of ball python listings on Morph Market started off right around 50,000 animals available at the beginning of the year, and it went down to about 35,000 animals. So this is 15,000 animals that were sold throughout 2024, even with people producing more animals and adding them into the market. So with this, again, I think it is obvious that auctions were super successful at moving animals throughout the entire year. But what ended up happening recently is that Morph Market put in a limitation on the auctions. For whatever reason, they decided that it wasn't good for their platform or for the hobby to have people having unlimited auctions as long as they spent the extra $25 per auction to do this. So at first they did away with the extra auctions entirely. So now it was only the amount of auctions that you got based off of your Morph Market membership. And when this happened, again, if you were a small breeder, you might not have even noticed it because you never bought extra auctions. But those rather large breeders that were spending a lot of money to purchase the extra auctions and were moving a ton of animals that way, now the main way that they were making revenue during 2024 was essentially crippled for them. Because if they are reduced to, let's just say, having 5 animals sell per month on an auction and they were used to having 50 animals sell per month, they are reducing their monthly revenue from auctions by about 90%. And again, these rather large breeders have a ton of expenses. They have a ton of overhead that they need in order to support their operations. And this drastic decrease, I think, had some really negative impacts for the biggest breeders in the hobby. now that their revenue streams were drastically cut, but their expenses are still super, super high, if not higher due to inflation in the previous years, they are in situations where they are not actually making money and that they're going further and further and further into the hole. And I think that this has put a lot of strain on the bigger breeders in the hobby, and that we have already started to see the cracks forming in them. In addition to auctions, I think that genetic testing is also hurting those top tier breeders in 2024 and certainly going into 2025 and 2026 down the road. And the reason why I think that genetic testing is hurting the top tier breeders is that it allows smaller and newer breeders with less capital to invest in their business to make the exact same kinds of animals that those top tier breeders are making without having to spend nearly as much money to get into those projects. So the example that I can use on this is the Sunset Clown project. If you were to go onto Morph Market and buy a Sunset Clown male right now, you're looking at between $15,000 and $20,000 to buy a double visual. But you can also go onto Morph Market right now and buy a clown 100% het sunset male for about $1,500. So this means that you could get the clown het sunset versus the double visual sunset clown for about 1/10 of the price. But when you go to breed these animals, the clown het sunset is still going to make the same types of animals that the sunset clown will, but statistically speaking, there will just be half as many of those animals. So for half of the power of the sunset clown, you can purchase it for 1/10 of the price of the sunset clown. So I think that a lot of breeders, especially smaller breeders who are on budgets and are trying to be savvy with their money, recognize this, and rather than spending $15,000 on a sunset clown, they've went out and they've bought maybe a clown het sunset with extra genes in them for maybe $3,000, $4,000, or even $5,000. And then they will just test all of the babies that they need to test to figure out exactly which ones are their holdbacks, and then the other ones they can sell for the appropriate price. Huge shout out, by the way, to RGI, who does the shed testing on Morph Market and on Clutch, for making this possible, because it has completely changed the industry and again has really leveled the playing field to let the smaller, newer breeders be much more competitive with anybody at whatever tier they are in. There is a negative side to this, because it means that those top tier animals, those $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 animals that previously were critical if you wanted to progress the projects, they are not the only way that you can use to get into those top tier, highest level projects and push the entire industry forward. And because there are other options that are not quite as effective in doing it, but are far more affordable, I think that there is a lot of people who are no longer even considering buying that $15,000, $20,000 sunset clown, and instead they are investing their money in a combo visual that is het for the other recessive. And because of this, I think that again, the top tier of the market and those top tier breeders who produce a lot of those animals are having problems selling them, at least for the prices that they want to. And those prices are also coming down pretty quickly throughout 2024. Between the auctions and shed testing during 2024, it's very obvious that smaller, newer breeders are disproportionately benefiting from these advancements. But it comes at a cost, and that cost is coming from the leaders and the icons in our industry that have made the hobby what it is today. Because when it no longer is financially viable to produce that many animals, a lot of these larger, bigger breeders are drastically reducing the size of their collections in order to try to get their expenses under control. And in addition to just simply reducing the size of their collections, there are some that are completely moving away from ball pythons because they are no longer set up to really be competitive in that landscape, and their interests have evolved to other species. So both of these factors, whether it is the reduction or the completely moving away from the species, I think is opening up an opportunity in 2025 and 2026, and maybe even all the way into 2027 for almost a changing of the guard moment in the ball python world. And what I think is going to end up happening is that a lot of these larger breeders, as they further and further step away from the breeding part of the ball python hobby, will be replaced by newer people that have gotten in the last 5 years or so. And as these newer people step up and they start growing their collections because they don't have nearly as much overhead, their businesses can be in a more viable position as long as it is still a hobby. And during the next boom, because there's always going to be a boom in the cyclical nature of our industry, those are going to be the people to capitalize it. And I believe that the people who have gotten in within the last 5-ish years or so, there are going to be some of them that will be the next generation's icons of the reptile industry. Overall state of the ball python market is that I think that if you are getting in right now, you're in a really, really good position. You can buy amazing animals for fractions of the cost that people previously had bought them. And I think that you have a lot of different avenues where you are able to sell those animals and make a profit on them in order to keep your business going. But I think that those who are in the biggest danger of getting hurt by the ball python market right now are those who have such large collections that their expenses completely outweigh the amount of revenue they are able to bring in when the prices are lower and animals aren't selling nearly as much unless it's an auction on morph market, and they are limited to the amount of auctions that they are able to do. Anyways, we hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next week.